Welcome to Pocket Fiction by Steve Cook. Poisonroot, Chapter 2, The House of the Victor. Trip opened one eye, then the other. The man's hand was open, waiting to pick him up.
Let's get you out of there. Get you cleaned up. You look like you could use a meal too, Victor grunted.
Trip blinked and took the offered hand, finding himself lifted out with little effort, and then he watched as the old hero started to bustle around the kitchen. Trip sat on one of the chairs and looked around in the yellow glow. The room was about 6 paces square, the furniture worn but cared for. A dresser was filled with plates, and the curtains had a flower pattern embroidered on them, matching the tablecloth. The only thing on the table was a portrait of a young woman.
"Why did you come here?"
"Something's following me, I told you. One of the things that attacked us, I think." Slipping his sandals off, Trip pulled his knees up to his chest and rested his heels on the edge of the chair. "I'm ahead of it, though. I don't think it can move very fast." The warmth began to penetrate his thin body. "I didn't stop to ask what it wanted. I knew from reading the books that you were here, and I knew you'd help. Because that's what you do." He nodded. "Like that time in Ehrian, where you saved the boy from the 3-headed eagle." Trip looked over at the man, whose shoulders had suddenly hunched. Victor turned and brought a plate over to the table. A huge slice of boiled ham lay between 2 equally huge slices of bread. Almost immediately, Trip realized he was starving, but he sat up straight and folded his hands over the meal, silently giving thanks. He was aware that the old man was watching him, and suddenly the simple act of saying grace was something to be embarrassed about like never before. Trip opened his eyes a tiny bit and watched as Victor relit his cigar.
"Best eat it, lad. Praying at it won't help."
Trip snapped his eyes shut and quickly finished the well-worn chant, then looked again at Victor. "May I begin?" In answer, the man waved his hand vaguely, and Trip took that as permission. The bread was good quality. The ham he left on the plate.
"Food won't eat itself, lad," Victor said, scowling.
"I don't eat meat," Trip said quietly.
Victor grunted. "You've read the books, then?" he muttered. "It ain't all like that, you know. Things was different."
He blew out more smoke and ran his tongue over his lips.
"Damned author, always with his audience in mind."
Trip swallowed and nodded. "I've read them all, Mr. Junn. Victor and the lion-headed priest of Shamun, Victor and the Ingir, Victor and the Korokalok, even Victor and the Death Lord of Firik. That one was my favourite." He took another bite of sandwich and spoke round it. "We had them all in the library. The elders said I wasn't supposed to read them, but I only had to read them once."
"Tell me, what do you remember from the attack?"
Victor leaned forward and folded his arms onto the table. Trip chewed more slowly, then put the remains of the bread back onto the plate. Suddenly his appetite had fled. It was as if the ground came alive. He closed his eyes and painfully allowed the memory to surface. He looks around. Dead people everywhere. People he lives and works with. Too many to cry for, too quick to mourn. All around, men fighting living man-plants. A scream to one side. Father Tomix is grabbed by the shoulders. The ground opens up under him and the plant man pulls him down. The scream cuts off. Trip surfaced and stopped talking, his voice suddenly choking in his throat. He coughed and forced himself to take another bite of the sandwich, chewing mechanically, swallowing heavily before continuing. As he spoke, the memory assaulted every sense, pinning him down like a dead weight. "I was asleep when the attack started. There were 3 people, dead on the floor outside my chamber. I couldn't see any of the other acolytes, and the bodies were—" He tried to concentrate on his roiling stomach as he pushed down images of red smears, pools of still liquid reflecting candlelight. Barely even aware of the tears falling from his face, Trip continued, "Brother Matthew got me to some kind of escape tunnel, pulled me through it. It brought me out by a small lake. Then he told me to run away, and went back to the monastery, back to the fight." Trip sniffed and blinked away tears. I started to run. By the time I got to the road, the library was on fire, everything burning." Victor grunted and sat back.
"I'm a mite vexed that someone's destroyed the monastery up there, but from what you've said, it's done. Done to death."
Trip felt his eyes well up again and he looked away. Victor paused and then cleared his throat.
Perhaps not the best words. Anyway, you've got your life and your health. Why are you here bothering me?
The plant! Trip sat bolt upright and looked around. It'll be here soon. Something followed me all the way from the monastery. I spotted it just after Helga's rise.
Victor raised an eyebrow. That's 8 hours travel, child. You telling me you've kept ahead for all that time?
It's coming. I know it. You have to protect me. Trip sat back down and looked into the man's eyes. I need you, Mr. Junn, just like Jarin needed you in Stern.
Victor waved his hand. Jarin was a 30-year-old Koru swordmaster. He didn't need me, and neither do you. Nothing's hunting you down, boy. Probably someone from the monastery who survived is looking for you.
Fumbling at the neckline of his habit, Trip blurted, I have money.
Oh, money, is it?
Trip drew out the gold pendant he had been given by Brother Matthew. It hung from a chain, a single ruby shining from the centre of the inscribed gold disc, glinting dully in the flickering light. Brother Matthew's sweat-covered hand pressing against his. Take this, Trip. Use it as needed. He kneels down, his eyes boring into the small boy's. Live, Trip. And then he is gone, running to the library. Victor reached down and took it.
Where'd you get this?
This is... he started, then shook his head and tossed the medallion back to Trip.
No, I'm retired, boy.
Please,
I said...
The door rattled loudly, cutting off the sharp retort. Both man and boy turned to look, and then Trip grabbed Victor's hand and tried to press the medallion into his loose grip. That's the plant. Say you'll take me as far as Rootholm. Please!
You keep saying plant, lad. That's supposed to scare me.
But Trip had stopped listening. He had caught the small movement under the door, oozing around the hinges and easing through the tiny gaps in the wood. It was as if the door had suddenly become the most fertile ground in the world, and the plants were taking full advantage. Suddenly the plate on the table began to vibrate, moving slowly towards the edge. The panes of glass in the windows rattled, and cooking utensils, hung on hooks, started to sway from side to side. Trip watched with mounting horror as the plate walked to the edge and fell with a smash. What the old man muttered, looking at the shards on the floor, and then suddenly the entire house shook. Victor bolted to his feet, grabbed one of the swords from the rack, and moved towards the front door. Trip got up and backed away, feeling his way around the chairs. Panic rushed through him as he gaped, unable to tear his eyes away from the wall of green that had now completely covered the door. Victor grunted and swung his sword, but before he could make contact, a tendril of green lashed out and snatched it away from him. He lurched backward as grasping shoots reached for his head and neck.
Bugger this for a lark,
he grunted, and started to back away from the growing green mass. He looked down at Trip, then grabbed his arm.
Come on, lad, back door, he said,
and Trip allowed himself to be pulled along in the man's wake. Victor grabbed the other sword from the rack and used it to smash one of the windows. Trip, finally realizing that he was going to die if he didn't move, grabbed hold of the chair and tipped it into the way of the creeping greenery that was already covering the rug and curling up over the table.
Come on, lad,
Victor shouted, already halfway through the broken window. Trip ran to the window and started to crawl through the hole, then recoiled as glass stabbed into his hands. As if scenting the blood, the coiling green tendrils boiled out from every angle and moved directly for him, wrapping around his wrists and ankles, painfully tight. Trip screamed in panic, and then felt himself pulled forward as Victor grabbed hold of his shoulders. The old man sliced neatly through all of the tendrils holding Trip, and stood him on his feet.
Run, lad, he shouted,
then turned and set off in the direction of the village's centre. Trip shook his head and followed him, cradling his hands. He stumbled, falling to the ground as it convulsed beneath him, and as he sat up he saw Victor staring back at his house. He looked up as a cracking sound echoed through the night air. The entire house was covered in greenery. Even as they watched, more tendrils soared into the sky and curled around the roof, caving it in with sharp stabbing motions. A shudder ran through the entire construct and, with a jerking movement, the house seemed to fall apart, crumbling into pillars of stone and wood that tumbled down and crushed the main body of the plant. It spasmed once, and was still. Victor moved forward a few steps.
My home, he murmured.
Then he turned to Trip and grabbed him viciously by the shoulders.
What did you bring to my home, you little gutter snipe?
Trip stared into his eyes, too shocked for words. After a moment, Victor released him and turned to gaze on the ruin that had been his house. Trip felt the pain from his hands increase, and he stared down at the cuts, blood oozing out of them. His stomach churned, and he suddenly felt lightheaded. He slumped to the ground, and everything went black for a timeless moment.